So this week we're going to be talking about a world that's in turmoil and decline. There's a lot going on across the globe right now as civilizations are still trying to find their footing, and they're being redefined by conditions around them, as well as the relationship between different civilizations. So we'll start first with China. Now, China is a place that grew out of 10,000 kingdoms, which really led to a particular way of building cities and developing their architecture. So across this lecture, we're going to be looking at these different constructions, these different works of architecture from China, from Egypt, and all the way actually into North America now. And so you can kind of see the relative sizes of the different sites now, and we'll talk about how these kind of differing forms came out of the relationship of especially religion, as well as kind of the central ruling bodies and governmental processes, and how those related to the everyday citizens and was manifested in different types of architecture. So in China, the centralization of power had not really happened yet. There were still these many different power groups in these 10,000 kingdoms. And what that did was it led to a really defensive type of architecture, because these different kingdoms were always vying for power and always attacking each other. And so what was happening was the royal persons of these different kingdoms started to become connected to and become a symbol of the cosmic powers that govern the world and organize their particular civilization. During this time, religion really became the foundation for Chinese rulership and really became closely connected to the power and the organization of the entire civilization. So, in the Shang Dynasty, a lot was happening that formed the basis for what was to come in Chinese architecture and culture and organization of a civilization in general. What was interesting about the architecture at this time was because of the strength of religion and how it had become the foundation of the power structure in China. A lot of the early architecture was tied to the rituals versus the actual kind of everyday function of what buildings were. And so it was really kind of hard to tell, going back and digging these buildings up, what the buildings were used for, because the ritualistic structure kind of governed how the organization of the building happened, more importantly than did its practical function. So the most important part of the building was its ritualistic and spiritual center. And this is, where ancestors and gods, important persons, are venerated and celebrated in Chinese culture. And so the way a building was organized around this veneration of either ancestors or gods, and was more important than what was going on in the practical nature of the building. And so the cosmic symbolism of the Chinese culture was really integrated and really meshed into the architecture of every building, from palaces all the way to granaries and to other more functional buildings, everyday buildings, and really became a part of the architecture more so than anything else. And so if we move over into the Mediterranean and look at the Minoans and their city of Knossos, the turmoil that was happening in the Mediterranean was what gave rise to Crete as a powerful civilization. They were uniquely positioned in the Mediterranean between kind of this West Asia, Egypt, and Europe, and really gave them an opportunity to rise as a maritime merchant nation. So they were really involved in creating these trade routes between these different areas and really stitching together this West Asia, Egypt, and European centers of civilizations. Um, Now, as kind of a consequence of this, well, and let me put Crete into a little bit of context as well. The Minoans. This is where the labyrinth myth is generated with the Minotaur, but but really the economic and the geographical position of Crete made it a unique civilization, different than what was happening in China and in Egypt. And so, if we look at the palace at Knossos, you kind of get a sense right off that this actually looks like a very modern structure. This could be a campus of, Apple or Microsoft or, some large company's office campus. It's organized in a very similar manner and has that kind of straightforward modernist look to it, including some very unique features that came out of where the Minoans were placed in this trading maritime merchant sort of civilization. So the palace architecture, unlike China, who had to really worry about defending against those other 9,999 kingdoms, didn't have a defensive posture. And this was because of their island location and also because they were very peaceful traders and they weren't going around pissing anybody off and having people come and try to invade them. They were actually performing a function between these civilizations that was beneficial to all, and so there was no reason for them to develop defensive fortifications against anybody. So as a result, they come up with this very open, very integrated palace, unlike those in China that were much more defensive in nature. And so, because there were no economic or political stresses, they also didn't develop a complex cosmology to explain these stresses as China had. When you have 10,000 kingdoms all vying for power, you're kind of constantly in battle and constantly stressed. And so you're looking for that outlook and that explanation and understanding of the world through rituals, through cosmology, through some sort of complex explanation of why things are bad or good, so that you can get through the day, basically. They did retain their chthonic religious practices, which is just a focus on the underworld. And so deities became much more intimately and less formally integrated into everyday life than did the religious practices of Egypt and Mesopotamia. This affected architecture because you were not creating these larger structures. It was more about having these rituals and ceremonies as part of an individual experience. Plus, holy places were connected to the landscape features rather than being heavenly or tied to rituals. So the whole land was holy to begin with. So you didn't need to go around creating temples and specific places that would hold these hold this kind of reverence or specialness of place, because the environment, the place they were in, was special to begin with, which is kind of an interesting tie to today if you think about sustainability and our relationship to the land. It's less now about having very special places that represent the entire um, kind of possibility of ecosystem and sustainable practices, but it's seeping more and more into our everyday life. So even urban cities like Austin, because of the land management practices and being more aware of our environment, there are deer and coyote and horny toads and all these all these individual representations of the environment and wildlife creeping back into the city. And so now everywhere is more of a kind of sustainable environment, instead of just these very special reserve places of national parks or state parks or preserves that represent the entirety of the environment. So as the religion developed in the Minoan civilization back to 1500 BCE, the religion did become more complex, and because of this, it started to include more and more people. So mass celebrations like Austin City Limits required more open landscape in front of these major palaces. Caves were also important because of the underworld religious ties, and um, and so there were also the creation and origin myths of the Minoans that relied heavily on this underworld connection. Um, so palaces also combine kind of the everyday practical functions with religious centers. So it was kind of closely integrated, but more equally distributed and not not hung up in particular temples or places. And so looking at Knossos, um, the plan and the use of the building was much more open because of the safe nature of the civilization and the strong connection between inside and outside, where they have open verandas, windows, and this real interrelationship between indoors and outdoors, which started to become very intricate as they developed their notions of how they should live and how they were connected to the environment. And so the palaces were very nicely decorated and apportioned, with some very nice gypsum walls with paintings on them. Their columns were structural columns, um, and basically had these kind of pillow capitals, with a nice kind of clean, slender, strong um, shaft and um, and a rendering that again is kind of stripped down and kind of straightforward compared to the Egyptians, which we'll look at here in a little bit. But the Minoans were the first civilization where their art started to represent human movement, and so the notion of moving through space was a part of their culture and a part of how they thought about the world, which was different than what had happened previously. Um, this came into play in their palaces, which were long and linear and were all about the sequence of gates and antechambers, where movement from the outside to inside places was really complex, and it was very rich in the experience of actually moving through the place. So it wasn't about just having one nice space that everybody goes to, but it was about how do you create and prepare through the moving towards this destination place, um, so that you are prepared as you get there, and the journey becomes the experience, not just the destination. And so these destination places of ceremony or power were led up to with grand stairways, colonnades, directional changes, and it really created this intricate entrance sequence that prepared you for the arrival into a very special place. Um, it's a really good way of indicating what places are special, and the way that you prepare people before they get there frames what they think about the place once they do arrive. So now in Egypt, there was a lot going on in Egypt at this time. Um, a new kingdom arose um, after an invasion by the Hyksos from the north, which we don't really know exactly where they came from. But after driving these invaders out, there was a new kingdom that was formed that changed the Egyptians from being isolationists to colonizers. And so they've moved up and out of the Nile River Delta, and they're starting to move up the Gaza Strip and um, into this kind of West Asia, Middle East area, and really looking to expand their empire. So along with this came a new unity, um, which brought religion to the masses. So now there are large festivals that drew thousands of people. It was more about including the people in the rituals and in the religious experience beyond just the elite, who used to practice it off by themselves, out of sight of kind of the general public. So the trade that the Minoans were a big part of really helped connect Egypt and West Asia, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and then the developing area up in Europe. And so Egypt took great advantage of this strong trade, which was not happening over in China because people were more concerned about being at war with each other at the time. And so looking at Indus, which modern day India, the Proto-Persia, Iranian kind of area, and back out into China, none of that area was really strongly hooked into what was going on trade-wise, and so their civilizations were developing in a different way than the Egyptians could. Um, so one thing that became um, really important in Egypt at this time was that religion and power again become very closely connected. And it was the religious and spiritual part of the culture that gave the kings their ruling authority. And so large temple institutions became central to life and politics. And like at the temple at Karnak, um, the procession to and from these places was an opportunity to include more people as well as um, kind of bring like the Minoans were a more of a sense of place at these destinations once they got there, because you're prepared by this pilgrimage or this processional route that really extended the power and the reach of these religious centers. Now, mortuary temples also became very important at this time, and um, and were spread all over. Um, these became really important as transition spaces for royalty going from this world to the other world. Um, this life after death idea um, made the architecture the point of transition, and so became really important to culture. Now, a lot of times, the alignment of the buildings were either along cardinal directions, or they were angled specifically to connect to other places which were important symbolically somehow. So these axes and these ways of orienting buildings start to add meaning and substance to what people believed in the culture and the civilization that was building it. And so temples were really not thought of as kind of finalities or complete structures. In other words, once they were built, it wasn't like you can't touch it, this is perfect, this is the way it's always going to be, which is what the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, and later the Romans thought. Instead, they viewed it as a place that could change, could grow, could be rebuilt, could be torn down. It wasn't necessarily sacred architecture, but it was architecture for sacred events that could change and could be modified over time according to the use that was needed. And so these long axial plans where you go through hippostyles, you go through colonnades, you go through gateways, all signify the importance of where you're going and how you're thinking about where it is that you're going and the importance of what's happening. And these very monumental structures are supposed to put you into a certain state of mind in order for you to be prepared to be a part of ceremonies, rituals, or in the case of kings, it prepares you for the afterlife and acts as a transition to the afterlife, to wherever you were expecting to end up. So columns were very important to the Egyptians. The hypostyle halls with these multitude of columns were all ornately dressed, were all thought about as ways of conveying information. And the Egyptians were really the first to develop the column as more than just a load-bearing element, and it becomes much more of a symbolic piece. And the importance of the symbolism was just as, if not more important, than the structural function that it was taking on. And so columns in ritual places were places where people put reeds and flower stalks and those sorts of offerings to denote sacred places, and those eventually made it into the actual form of the column themselves. And so these columns are reed stalks that are kind of bundled together, which come directly from the offerings denoting the sacred spaces, and become part of the architecture itself. So the ritual and the actions of humans are now being drawn directly into architecture, where they're being kind of abstracted or represented somehow as a way of standing in for those rituals that had taken place before. And so the surfaces of these columns and of walls and bits of architecture really became a canvas for explaining what was going on in the ritual, in the everyday lives of Egyptians. It became a place to express themselves and to create symbols for what their civilization stood for. And so architecture became really important as a way of conveying this information and as a way of embodying the civilization itself. And so through this, there were many texts that were developed on architecture, surveying, and town planning, which really pointed to how important the Egyptians thought architecture was. These texts included very specific formulas and ways of relating specific bits of the column, and in particular, to different senses, for instance. And so they became metaphors through mathematics of what the sensibilities of the civilization were. It was so important, in fact, that there was a goddess of architecture and reckoning called Sishat, and there were priest architects who had control of stashes of building plans. it would be great if civilization revered architects as much today as they did back in Egyptian times. Um, but the idea that architects were elevated to this kind of priesthood um, really shows you how important the Egyptians thought architecture was. So moving on to the Hittite Empire, the Hittites were up in what is now modern day Turkey, and they and the Egyptians were in conflict because they were both colonizing and both spreading their spheres of influence into Syria and the Middle East region. So they were really rivals of the Egyptians, but they came to a point where they realized that this wasn't doing either one of them any good, and they signed a treaty that still hangs today in the UN as a symbol of how everybody can prosper if you basically just figure out how to get along instead of spending all your resources fighting foreign wars. So similar to the Mesopotamians, the Hittites had a complex set of gods and goddesses, which had a weather god at its center. And so for the Hittites, the temples were very important. But they also had outdoor sanctuaries. So there's kind of a combination of what was going on in China and Egypt and on Crete with the Minoans. Um, but their temples were definitely very important places. So like the Mesopotamians, they didn't have columns or capitals, and they grouped buildings around paved courts, which would allow individual citizens, the masses, to become part of what was going on with the ceremonies. They had very tall windows that started at the floor and moved up, so the visual connection between indoors and outdoors was really strong. They had colonnades like the Egyptians, except that they used walls and piers instead of columns. Um, but there was this very distinct and deliberate tension that they created in their buildings between symmetry and asymmetry, just as the Minoans had. And so, looking at the temple at Ephesus, you can see how the court and the centralized area was very symmetrical, but the buildings ringing it were more asymmetric and brought this tension between the interior court and the exterior stores. And then even the sanctuary is located off center of the court, so that you have to make this very deliberate reorientation between the court into the sanctuary, so that you notice that you're in a different place, that you're in a special place. So the main places were approached indirectly, and unlike the Minoans' linear movement, it was more about slipping into places. It was more about informally and kind of discreetly getting from one place to another, instead of having this very deliberate linear progression that was prescriptive and very deliberate in how you got from one place to another. This was a little more sneaky. It was a little more interesting in order to set up this tension that they enjoyed. And only the priests and elite were really allowed in the innermost sanctums, and so that's why there was this separation from the courts and the large groups of people, which makes sense to put it kind of off center, which is a little bit hard to get to. So contrasting that with Poverty Point in North America, the other civilizations of the time were pretty advanced compared to what was going on here, where there were very primitive constructions of earthen mounds, basically just piling up bunches of dirt. But there was actually a very complex relationship to a cosmological organization from places like Stonehenge, where the way the sun and the stars moved became very integral to the culture and to the civilization, and to how people performed their everyday lives. Um, so there was a very sophisticated connection there, even though the actual structures were not necessarily that sophisticated, especially not like what was going on in Egypt and places like that. So the Poverty Point people spread, all the way from kind of New Orleans up into Illinois along the Mississippi River drainage basin, and had these mounds all up and down um, rivers, very closely tied to rivers here in the middle of North America. Now, they had a very extensive trading culture, and along with that, religious rituals which were tied to the mounds, as well as to the secular activities that were happening. So there was, again, a very close connection between religion and everyday activities, which were manifested in the architecture. And you could see in the architecture where you may have a storage place that became this mound and became a ritualized place, maybe to the activity that was being performed um, in it. And again, thinking back to the comparison of the size of these places, um, the Poverty Point um, mounds and complexes were actually quite large, and they were more spread out, possibly because there was more land and not as much pressure of competing civilizations, like the Chinese did, with their 10,000 kingdoms all battling each other. But this was much more focused on trade and getting along peacefully, and so they didn't need these defensive structures that were happening elsewhere in the world. And so along about this time, the Peruvians, or the modern day area of Peru, um, the civilization started moving from the coastline and depending on fishing for their existence, started to move from those coastal areas up into the mountains, where trade actually became easier, and it was more important to their civilization than it was before. So large storage structures for centralized agricultural economies sprung up. The and the architecture responded to this need for supporting trade and for supporting an economy that was making excess goods that could be traded. So now you needed a centralized storage area that started to centralize power, and um, and also what it did, very interestingly enough, was start this kind of competition among the elites who were owning and building and making these things happen, which pushed ritual complexes higher or taller and to become much more complex. So the burial sites are disconnected from the centralized religion at this point. There were sacrifices of adults and children, and places like Salinas de Chao show a real integration of the kind of the ritual complexes within an urban fabric, unlike the places of Europe, of China or Egypt, where these ritualized complexes were separate from everyday life. And so the architecture reflected these elaborate ceremonies and processions. And they were also embodied with kind of these larger cosmic orders, but they were spread around and they became part of what the masses were doing in their everyday lives. And so this sort of activity is not unlike today, where you're thinking about skyscrapers. Um, Starting in Chicago in the late 1800s, people started building very tall buildings, and most of this came from ego. It's not necessarily that the land is actually that valuable, or that people need to be that high up in the air to do whatever it is they're doing, but these became kind of one-upmanship acts where one rich guy wanted to outdo another rich guy, and so he built a taller skyscraper. So this goes on today, and the people of the high Andes were doing this back in 1500 BCE. So really, as we're looking at all these civilizations, and as you're working on your papers, looking at the connection between places in architectural history and what went into creating those, and why they are the way they are, and looking at places today that you can experience, we're not really that different. We're still human beings. We still have certain needs. We have certain desires, and we have um, this underlying feeling of wanting to be able to understand the world and what's going on around us. And so, religion and this cosmological explanation of what's going on in the world has always been really important to us. And even today, um, it 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 affects how we build. It affects how we think about the relationship between buildings and cities, and how we treat our landscapes, how we treat our environment, how we treat our natural spaces, and basically is an extension of what happened way back, um, in 1500 BCE, and is not that much different today. We just have different building materials. We have different priorities, and different kind of different focus on different elements. There are different levels of power of the different components that are making up our society today, and they're ever shifting, and they always will be shifting depending on what the conditions are of geography, of climate, of economy. All of those things combine into a manifestation of the times in the architecture that we build. So, looking at your papers, keep this in mind that every piece of architecture, be it a building, be it an entire city, be it a landscape like a large park, or a small park for that matter, or anything that we build in the environment and shape the environment with, is a manifestation of the forces of materials, geography, climate, religion, culture, economy. And they really become an indicator of where we are as a civilization at any particular time.